At Starbound, we tell stories the human way, not with artificial voices or AI slop. In the end, what's HFI without humanity? Subscribe to keep it this way. My name's I Am Duck. Let's begin. The reactor was going to detonate in 90 seconds, which, considering Rafe was injured, upside down and on the wrong side of the galaxy, felt suspiciously generous. His head throbbed in time with the wail of a dozen dying alarms, a cacophony that blended into a single, overwhelming note of despair. Red lights painted his face in strobing bursts of doom, each pulse a fresh spike of pain through his skull. A tang of superheated ceramic and burnt wiring was a physical taste at the back of his throat, the flavor of catastrophic failure. He was strapped into the cockpit of his recon fighter, the Nomad, but the view through the fractured canopy wasn't the star-dusted black of space. It was mud, twisted roots, and the sickly green glow of alien fungi. He'd crashed. More accurately, he'd been shot down, a detail that felt both pedantic and crushingly important. He was the last of Nomad flight, the only one. The thought was a shard of ice in his gut, colder than any vacuum. A new alarm, a shrill, insistent shriek, cut through the others, high and pure. The reactor, it was going critical. Fun's over, Rafe grunted to the empty cockpit. Adrenaline, a glorious pain-numbing chemical, flooded his veins. He walled off the agony from his ribs and leg, a grim mental trick learnt over a dozen campaigns. The pain would demand payment later, with interest, but for now it was silent. He slapped the quick release on his harness and dropped, landing in a heap of what used to be the ceiling. A sharp, grinding protest from his torso, and a bolt of white-hot fire from his left leg served as a polite reminder of his injuries. He ignored them. His motions were frantic but sure-handed, a desperate ballet of survival. Even as he went down, his instincts had taken over. In the final moments of the crash, knowing the ship was a loss, he'd done one last thing. He'd slammed his fist into the avionics panel, ripping the emergency long-range comms unit free from its housing. It was a brick of metal and fused silica, his only microscopic hope of ever speaking to another human being again. He clutched it to his chest as the Nomad met the ground. Now he fumbled for it on the floor, his fingers closing around its reassuringly solid frame. It was battered, but it was there. He shoved it into his survival pack. Next, the emergency cache beneath his seat. Sidearm, a kinetic slug thrower. Old, but reliable. Check. The pack itself, a bulky olive drab bag that was 90% hope and 10% actual useful gear. Check. Medkit? Check. He slung the pack over his shoulder, the movement sending a fresh wave of agony through his torso, and holstered the pistol. The reactor's shriek was climbing to an unbearable pitch, the ship around him groaning as its bones began to melt. "Leaving so soon?" he muttered, kicking at the shattered canopy. It didn't budge. He reversed his grip on the pistol and slammed the butt against a stress fracture. The transparent steel spider webbed, then gave way with a groan. He scrambled through the opening, half crawling, half falling out onto the wet, alien soil. He didn't look back. He just ran. Or more accurately, he hobbled, dragging his bleeding leg through the muck, each step a fresh argument with his screaming nerves. He dove behind a rocky outcrop, just as the world behind him turned into a sun. The shockwave hit a second later, a physical blow that slammed him against the rock and stole the air from his lungs. The sound was a deafening final crack that vaporized his ship. His last link to his squadron, to his life before this moment. Silence descended. broken only by the ringing in his ears and the slow drip of water from an overhanging ledge. He lay there for a long moment, chest heaving, the after-image of the blast seared into his retinas. He pushed himself up, his hand shaking. His suit's internal sensors were flickering. Atmospheric contaminant warning, metallic particulates, low concentration. Fragments of a corrupted briefing file flashed in his memory. Kainos 3, terraforming, catastrophic failure, environmental instability. He looked around, half buried in the mud, skeletal and rusted. Were the silent forms of old machines, four-legged with long articulated arms ending in grasping claws. Scavenger drones. He scraped mud off one. Project Kainos, Stage 3, read the faded stencil. A boneyard. He was utterly, completely alone. And then he saw it, a second plume of smoke, thinner and blacker than his own, rising from a ridge about a click to the east. Another crash. Hope, that stubborn, idiotic weed, sprouted in the wreckage of his soul. Maybe one of his wingmen had made it. Kira, Rorik, Old Man Jameson. Anyone. He got to his feet, ignoring the liquid fire in his leg, and started moving. The second crash site was elegant. Where his nomad had been a tangle of wires and shattered plating, this vessel was a shard of black fused metal, all sleek curves and biomechanical grace. The vessel seemed not so much crashed as violently planted. Zarethi, the sigil of the Imperium, a stylized three-pronged claw, was still faintly visible on the hull, an arrogant symbol of order even in chaos. The hope in his chest curdled into a familiar, bitter rage. He drew his pistol, the solid weight of small comfort, and crept closer, using the terrain for cover. In the twisted heart of the wreckage, a figure was moving. Tall, clad in the form-fitting black and silver armor of the Zarethi warrior caste. A commander. By the markings on her collar, she was trying to free a leg, which was pinned beneath a heavy piece of the fuselage. Rafe froze, his fingers tightening on the trigger. This was the enemy. The architect of his squadron's demise, the reason Kira's last transmission had been a scream. He could end it right here. One shot. Justice. Vengeance. All the words that sounded so good in your head and felt so hollow afterward. But then his suit's sensors chirped again. Atmospheric contaminant warning. Particulate density increasing. Acidity rising. He looked at his gloved hand. A fine greenish mist was beginning to fall, clinging to the fabric. Not just water. The Zarethi commander finally wrenched her leg free with a sharp, guttural cry of effort. She turned, her movements fluid despite her injury, and her eyes locked onto his. They were the color of molten silver, wide and startling in a face of severe plains and aristocratic disdain. She held a weapon in her hand, a sleek energy pistol that hummed with latent power. They stood there, two survivors at the galaxy's edge, separated by 20 meters of mud and decades of war. Human, she said. The word was a blade, sharp and cold. Zarethi, he spat back, the name tasting like ash. He raised his pistol. She mirrored the movement. A perfect standoff. Except it wasn't perfect. His vision was starting to tunnel, the blood loss from his leg finally catching up to him. The ground tilted. He swayed, planting his good foot to steady himself, and the world went grey at the edges. He blinked, fighting it, but his body had other ideas. With a soft curse, he collapsed to one knee, his head swimming. Across the clearing, he saw her flinch. just for a fraction of a second. A tremor ran through her weapon hand, a flicker of unguarded surprise. Then it was gone. Her face once again a mask of perfect, disciplined control. She assessed his pathetic state, the ragged breathing, the way he was propped up by one trembling arm, the blood soaking his trousers. Slowly, deliberately, she lowered her weapon. It wasn't mercy. He could see it in the cold calculus of her eyes. It was a pragmatic decision. A wounded, dying enemy wasn't a threat. She freed herself completely, her movements stiff. He watched as she reached up, her jaw set, and brutally slammed her own shoulder back into its socket with a sickening crunch. She didn't scream. She didn't even grunt. She just took a single sharp breath and then stood, assessing him again. The way she held herself, a telltale rigidity in her torso, suggested more than just a dislocated shoulder. Internal damage. Good. The green mist was thickening, becoming a drizzle. Where the droplets landed on the metal hull of her ship, they left faint, discolored patches. The danger wasn't instantaneous. It was prolonged exposure, a slow, inexorable dissolving. Corrosive, he gritted out, the word tearing at his dry throat. We need shelter. Her silver eyes flicked from the sky to the terrain, her expression one of pure tactical evaluation. Agreed. Her gaze fell on a dark fissure in the rock face, 100 meters away, a shallow cave. There, she commanded and started walking. Pride be damned, he couldn't stand on his own. He pushed himself up, leaning heavily against a piece of wreckage. She watched him for a moment, then moved on. He had no choice but to follow, dragging his ruined leg behind him. The drizzle was turning into a steady rain now, and a faint hissing sound rose around them, like the whole planet was being slowly etched away. They stumbled into the cave, just as the rain began to fall in earnest, a furious percussion on the rocks outside. The cave was small, barely a hollow in the rock, littered with the skeletal remains of more of those four-legged drones. They were trapped, two mortal enemies huddled in a dusty tomb, surrounded by the ghosts of failed technology. The cave smelt of wet earth. They took opposite sides of the small place, the silence between them charged with their shared pain and the unspoken promise that as soon as the rain stopped, they would likely try to kill each other. Inside the relative safety of the cave, the acid rain, a furious percussion on the rocks outside, they established the new rules of engagement, which is to say they tried to wound each other with words. Your species is emotionally incontinent, Vela stated, her voice flat and clinical. She unpacked a small, elegant Zarethi survival kit, laying out its contents on a flat rock, each item placed in a neat row, equidistant from the next. You are governed by base impulse. It makes you predictable. It is why you lose. Rafe was propped against the cave wall, trying to get a pressure bandage around his leg without passing out. Yeah, well, your perfect emotional control and strategic superiority got your fancy ship shot down, just as good as my impulse-driven chaos. He shot back, his voice strained. We're both sitting in the same mud, Your Highness. Difference is my gear was made to be fixed with a wrench and a cuss word. What happens when your superior Zarethi engineering meets a brutally simple, chaotic environment it wasn't designed for? Her silver eyes narrowed. My technology is the pinnacle of biomechanical engineering, not a brute force cudgel. It requires a delicate touch and care, both of which were absent during my descent through this planet's unstable magnetic field. She gestured dismissively at his gear. Yours is agricultural, It works, he grunted, finally securing the bandage. Which is more than I can say for yours at the moment. Her only response was a tightening of her lips. The hostility was a shield for them both, a familiar rhythm in a world gone sideways. He watched her lay out her supplies, a water purifier that looked like a silver seed, nutrient paste in sleek tubes, a self-heating thermal cloak, orderly, sterile. He dumped his own pack on the ground with a thud, a dented canteen, ration bars in crinkling wrappers, a flare gun, a tangled mess of cord, and a dog-eared paperback. Her gaze lingered on the book with a kind of anthropological curiosity. You waste mass on archaic entertainment? It's called preparing for the inevitable boredom of being marooned with a totalitarian space elf, Rafe said, picking it up. It's a classic, Moby Dick. It's about a guy who gets so obsessed with killing a big white whale, he gets his whole crew killed. He paused, the words catching in his throat like fishhooks. He tossed the book aside. Anyway, point is, sometimes you gotta have a distraction. Distraction is a symptom of an undisciplined mind, she said, activating her thermal cloak. A heat-haze distortion rose from its surface as it began to radiate a gentle warmth. And an undisciplined mind is what figures out how to use a busted power conduit to jumpstart a generator, he retorted, his sarcasm the only weapon he had left that wasn't causing him physical pain. It's called improvisation. You should try it sometime. Might have kept you out of this ditch. She didn't answer. She simply turned her back to him, a gesture of dismissal more profound than any insult, and stared out at the hissing green-yellow rain. They were alive, for now, but survival was going to be a long and deeply unpleasant negotiation. The negotiation ended abruptly on their third night. The rain had stopped, leaving the air sharp and clean. But the energy discharges from the two crashed ships had acted as a dinner bell. They came without a sound, scuttling over the rocks on multiple razor-sharp legs. They weren't organic, not really. Silicon-based life-forms, all jointed plates and angles, with shearing mouthparts that clicked like grinding glass. Shard hounds. The fragmented logs on Rafe's suit computer had called them. Aggressive local fauna. The first one was a shadow detaching itself from the other shadows at the cave mouth. Vela was on her feet instantly, her energy pistol raised. She fired a single brilliant blue bolt that hit the creature square in the thorax. It exploded in a shower of glass-like shrapnel. A perfect shot. But there wasn't just one. A pack of them swarmed the entrance, their eyes, made of countless tiny lenses, glowing with a hungry internal light. Vela fired again, and again, her movements economical and deadly. Two more hounds shattered. Rafe, his own slug thrower in hand, picked off a fourth as it tried to flank them. The cavern echoed with the crack of his kinetic rounds and the high-pitched whine of her energy weapon. They were a surprisingly effective team. Her marksmanship, his sheer volume of fire. For a moment he thought they might actually do it. Vela dropped another hound, then another. Her movements were a blur of deadly grace. 5 shots, 5 kills, but the hounds kept coming. He saw her glance at the charge indicator on her pistol. A flicker of concern crossed her face. A 6th shot took out a hound leaping from the rocks above. A 7th disintegrated another. Then she aimed for an 8th, and nothing happened. The weapon gave a soft, final chime. "Charge exhausted," she stated, her voice laced with a frustration so profound it was almost an emotion. The pinnacle of Zarethi engineering had a limited battery, and she had just used it up, without a single wasted shot. It wasn't enough. A hound, larger than the others, chose that exact moment to lunge. It wasn't aiming for him, it was going for her, at her exposed side where she held the useless weapon. Rafe didn't think. There was no tactical analysis, no weighing of probabilities. There was only the image of a silver-eyed alien commander about to be torn apart, and the sudden, overwhelming, and utterly illogical instinct that he could not let that happen. He moved. He threw himself in front of her, grabbing the heaviest piece of debris he could reach, a jagged shard of his own ship's hull plating. He used it as a shield. The hound's bladed foreleg, meant for her, slammed into the metal with a screech. The force of the impact was immense, knocking him back into her. The creature's claws skittered off the plate and sliced deep into his left arm and side, tearing through his flight suit and flesh as if they were paper. Pain, absolute and binding, erupted through him, but his right arm was still moving, fueled by adrenaline and a rage he didn't understand. He brought the heavy hull shard down like an axe. It connected with the hound's skull with a sickening, wet crunch. The creature convulsed and went still. The other hounds, perhaps sensing the death of their alpha, hesitated. It was all the opening Rafe needed. He fired his pistol twice into the dark, the roar deafening in the small space. The pack scattered, melting back into the night. Silence returned. Rafe stood there for a second, swaying, the world a blurry, grey mess. The hull shard fell from his numb fingers with a clang. He looked down at his side. It was a disaster. Blood was not just dripping, it was pouring, a torrent of hot crimson, soaking his clothes and pooling at his feet. He looked up at Vela. Her face was a mask of stunned disbelief. Her mind, trained for a universe of logic and order, was struggling to compute the tactical absurdity of what he had just done. A fatal trade. He had shielded an enemy with his own body. It was an act of such profound, chaotic humanity that it broke her. He tried to say something clever, something sarcastic, a final, defiant quip. But the words wouldn't form. He just managed a weak, guttural sound before his knees buckled. "Shield," he rasped, a word of duty and failure. Then the world went black. Vela watched the human collapse, a marionette with its strings cut. The scent of his blood, coppery and shockingly vital, filled the small cave, overwhelming the mineral tang of the dead hound. Her training screamed at her. The threat is neutralized. Assess your own condition. Secure the perimeter. But her body wouldn't obey. She was frozen, her gaze fixed on the rapidly growing pool of red at her feet. He had saved her. He had taken a blow meant for her. Why? It was illogical. It was inefficient. It was a tactical blunder of the highest order. He had traded his life, a certainty, for the mere possibility of hers. The Zarethi Imperium was built on the principle that such sentimental, self-destructive impulses were a genetic flaw, a disease that humanity inflicted upon the galaxy. And yet, she was alive, and he was dying. The contradiction was a physical force, shattering the icy discipline that had governed her entire existence. With a curse that was sharp, guttural, and entirely her own, she moved. She dragged him deep into the cave, away from the entrance. He was heavier than he looked, a dead weight of muscle and bone. She laid him out on the cold stone floor, her hands moving with a desperate urgency. His breath was a shallow, wet rattle. She grabbed her medkit. It was a marvel of Zarethi bioengineering. She pressed the scanner against the ragged, gaping wound on his side. The device whirred, its soft blue light playing over his skin. A series of chimes indicated it had locked onto his unique human biology. Tissue synthesis procedure initiated. Estimated time to stabilization, 4.7 standard hours. Warning. Subject will experience extreme metabolic stress and severe pain during the procedure. 4.5 hours. She looked at his pale face, the shallow rise and fall of his chest. He was bleeding too fast. He didn't have 4 hours. He might not have 10 minutes. The machine's process was flawless, but it was not fast enough. It was a perfect solution for an imperfect situation. Desperation clawed at her. She thought of his stupid, sarcastic jokes, his infuriatingly resilient spirit, the thought of that spirit extinguishing, here in this forgotten hole, because her superior technology was too slow. It was unacceptable. An idea sparked in her mind, a thought so heretical, so profoundly taboo, that it made her feel physically ill. The medkit could be encouraged. The synthesis process could be accelerated with a compatible biocatalyst, a heretical, unapproved, and dangerous field modification. Her hand shook as she opened a sterile compartment and removed a sampling syringe. It was a violation of every law of genetic purity, a defilement of her very being, to mix her blood, the blood of the Kaya warrior caste, with that of a feral, short-lived primate. It was a crime punishable by social erasure and a dishonorable death. She looked at Rafe's still form, at the bloodless lips and the grey tinge to his skin. Honor, purity, discipline. What had those concepts done for her here? They had left her with an empty pistol and a dying ally. He, with his chaos and his impulse, had saved her life. It was a debt, and debts in the Zarethi Code must be paid. With a hiss of resolve, she plunged the needle into her own arm, drawing a vial of her dark, silver-sheened blood. She unsealed the medkit's catalyst port, a feature meant only for extreme emergencies, and injected her sample. The machine whirred, a low, inquisitive sound. Then a soft, multi-tone chime echoed in the cave. Catalyst accepted. Recalibrating synthesis grid. Warning. Unsanctioned catalyst may result in unpredictable cellular bonding. She pressed the applicator to his wound again. This time the effect was immediate and dramatic. A gelatinous field that wavered like a heat haze covered the gash, glowing with a soft, pearlescent light. Microfilaments, supercharged by her own life force, began knitting torn muscle and severed veins back together with incredible speed. The synthesized tissue wasn't a perfect match. Where it bonded with his skin, it left a strange, latticed pattern that glowed with a faint light that shifted in color, like the inside of an abalone shell. It was a scar, but it was also a graft, a literal, biological merging of their two worlds imprinted on his very flesh. He stirred, his brow furrowed, his eyes fluttered open, unfocused and delirious. He moaned, a low sound of pure agony as the accelerated healing process tore through him. Then his gaze drifted, finding her face in the gloom. The pain in his eyes was slowly replaced by a flicker of pained recognition. The sight of that stubborn, resilient spark of life, a spark she had just broken every rule to save, cracked something deep inside her. The ice around her heart didn't just splinter, it vaporized, and in its place was a terrifying, unfamiliar warmth. The weeks that followed were not a smooth transition into a competent routine. They were a grinding, desperate day-by-day education and failure. The planet Kaianos 3 was not an adversary to be tamed. It was a force to be endured, and it seemed to take a perverse pleasure in punishing their every mistake. Their initial attempts at securing food were a disaster of competing philosophies. Rafe, with his human ingenuity, spent 2 days constructing an elaborate deadfall trap near a game trail he'd found. He used vines, a carefully balanced log, and a trigger mechanism that was, he admitted, more complicated than it needed to be. Crude, but direct, he declared, dusting his hands off. Vela had watched the entire process with an air of detached superiority. Brute force, you seek to master the environment. The Zyrethi way is to understand it, to move within its systems. She then spent the day foraging, returning with a handful of hard, translucent fungi. The next morning his trap was sprung, but the heavy log had been cleverly dodged. All he'd caught was a single mocking feather. Vela's fungi, meanwhile, turned out to be a powerful purgative. They spent a miserable day huddled in a cave, taking turns rushing outside, their bodies racked with cramps. The angled surfaces were almost hexagonal, she'd managed to grit out, pale and sweating. Almost, he groaned back. It's a great way to die. They were starving. The nutrient paste and ration bars were long gone. Desperation became the catalyst for cooperation. They went back to the trap together. Is it too obvious? She said, her voice still weak. The fauna here are not unintelligent. They see the disturbance in the earth. They smell your scent on the vine. All right, Your Highness. You're the expert in understanding this system. What's your brilliant plan? She didn't rise to the bait. Instead, she pointed. There, the wind moves through that canyon. It will carry your scent away, and the ground bears rock. Your trap will leave no trace. Use the thorned vine from the ridge. Its scent is a natural deterrent to these shardhounds, but the herbivores are drawn to it. He watched her, then slowly nodded. He rebuilt the trap, simpler this time, following her guidance. The next day, a plump, furred herbivore was waiting for them. It wasn't a victory for his method or hers. It was their first taste of a combined effort, a fusion of his chaotic building and her orderly understanding. It was their first real meal in a week. Their life became a series of these shared failures and combined successes. They were constantly learning, adapting, arguing, and grudgingly teaching each other. Their small cave began to feel less like a prison and more like a workshop, but their tenuous stability was about to be uprooted. One evening, staring out from the cave mouth, Vela pointed to the horizon. Look. Rafe followed her gaze. In the twilight, a shadow was moving along the distant ridge. It was colossal, a walking mountain of flesh and rock-like plating that dwarfed the landscape. It moved with a slow, ponderous grace, its massive three-toed feet leaving craters in the earth. The Ridgewalker. Okay, Rafe said softly. That's big. It is not a predator, Vela said, her voice holding a note of analytical awe. It is a grazer. See the way it strips the metallic lichen from the rock faces. It is a force of nature and, she added, her tone sharpening, its migratory path. If my calculations are correct, we'll pass directly through this valley in approximately 5 days. Pass through as in walk by? Pass through as in trample everything in its path, including this cave. They had to move. Their first home, forged in desperation, was temporary. The search for a new shelter was a tense, 3-day affair, pushing them farther into the broken landscape. They found it at the base of a towering derelict structure, a massive skeletal ring half buried in the earth, an atmospheric regulator, one of the titanic failures of Project Kaianos. Tucked beneath its crumbling foundation was a new cave, larger and more defensible than their first. It was while they were moving their meager supplies that they ran into the drone. It was another scavenger, like the skeletons in their first cave, but this one was active, its single red eye glowing. It seemed to be patrolling the base of the regulator, moving with a jerky, unpredictable gait. Another one, Rafe muttered, his hand going to his pistol. Let's give it a wide berth. But the drone spotted them. A series of high-pitched clicks emanated from its speaker grill. It wasn't hostile, just inquisitive. It began to move towards them, its articulated claws clicking on the rock. "It's a security model," Vela said, recognizing the chassis. "It perceives us as an anomaly in its programmed territory." "Well, it can unperceive us," Rafe said, waving his arms. "Hey, Rust Bucket! Shoo!" The drone's response was to accelerate, its claws extended. The fight was a frantic, desperate scramble around the base of the ancient machine. Rafe tried to get a clear shot, but it was surprisingly fast. Vela, armed with a sharpened metal spear, darted in, trying to jam it into the drone's optical sensor. The drone swatted her spear aside and lunged for Rafe. He fired, the slug ricocheting off its armored chest. He tackled it, and they went down in a heap. As they wrestled, he slammed the drone's body against a thick, armored conduit snaking out from the base of the weather regulator. There was a shower of sparks, a loud crack, and the drone went dead. Rafe pushed it off him, panting. Problem solved. But it wasn't. Deep within the derelict regulator, the damaged conduit caused a catastrophic power surge. Ancient systems, dormant for decades, flickered to life and then died in a cascade of failures. A low, groaning hum began to emanate from the massive structure above them. The air grew still and heavy. "What was that?" Rafe asked. Vela was staring up at the regulator, her face grim. "That was the sound of you breaking the weather." She was right. The sky, which had been clear, was darkening with an unnatural speed. The atmospheric pressure was plummeting. They had, through a combination of bad luck and brute force, just created their own personal, localized hurricane. Back in the relative safety of their new cave, the consequences of Rafe's problem-solving became horrifyingly clear. The low hum from the regulator had become a deep, resonant thrum that vibrated in their bones. The wind outside began to pick up, howling through the canyons. While Vela secured their supplies deep in the cave, each item stowed in its proper place. Rafe's gaze fell on a piece of wreckage he'd spotted near her crash site a few days earlier. A large, intact segment of her ship's hull, containing the flight recorder. He hadn't mentioned it. He hadn't wanted to go anywhere near it. But now, a grim curiosity gnawed at him. He slipped out of the cave, the wind already tearing at his clothes. He found the recorder, a black box of some dark, glassy material, and brought it back. Vela watched him, her expression unreadable, as he handed it to her. "Figured you might want this," he muttered. She took it, her fingers brushing his. For a long moment, she just held it. Then, with a few swift, economical movements, she interfaced it with a small datapad from her kit. The Zarethi battle computer had been constantly recording and analyzing tactical data from the moment they entered the system. It had recorded his squadron's final, fatal moments from her own ship's perspective. She went still. Her back was to him, but he felt a sudden chill, a cold that seemed to radiate from her stillness, separate from the storm. When she finally turned, her face was a mask of cold, clinical fury. "I've analyzed the final tactical data from the engagement," she said, her voice devoid of all warmth. It was the voice of Commander Vela Thrin of the Zarethi Imperium, not the woman who had helped him hunt. "Your squadron's demise was the direct result of a 72% predictable tactical error. Your command, pilot." Rafe felt the blood drain from his face. She wasn't finished. She began to detail his failure with the cold, precise language of a battle analyst, her words like surgical instruments carving him open. "You broke your flight pattern to pursue a high-value, high-risk target. The maneuver exposed your wingman's flanks to a fighter squadron concealed within a localized gravimetric anomaly. An ambush scenario with a 93% probability of success for our forces. Your pursuit was an act of impulsive aggression, not sound strategy. You sacrificed your entire flight for a strategically insignificant chance at personal glory. It wasn't just an insult. It was an autopsy of his greatest shame, performed by the one person whose respect he had, against all odds, started to crave. Every word was a hammer blow, rebuilding the wall between them brick by painful brick. Shattered wasn't the right word. He was hollowed out. He didn't storm out into the wilderness. That would be giving her the satisfaction of a reaction. Instead, he retreated to the mouth of the cave, needing space, needing to breathe air that she wasn't occupying. The storm he had caused, was intensifying. Debris began to fly past the entrance. He started to work, his movements furious, jerky. He was going to improve his side of the shelter, his way. He dragged rocks, wove branches into a makeshift windbreak, and slathered the gaps with mud and leaves. It was a desperate, primal need to prove that his chaos, his human methods, had value, that he could build something that worked. "Your structure will not hold," Vela's voice cut through his frantic labor. "The wind shear will rip it apart. You're wasting energy and exposing yourself." He ignored her. Stubborn pride, raw and wounded, was all he had left. The first blast of wind hit his makeshift barrier, and it held. For a second, a flare of triumphant pride warmed him. The second blast ripped it to shreds. He was thrown back against the rock wall as his pathetic wall disintegrated. He was exposed, trapped in a vortex of freezing wind and flying rock just feet from the safety of the main cavern. The cold was a physical thing, sinking its teeth into his bones. His stubborn pride had built his own icy tomb. Vela watched his folly with a cold, burning fury. Let the weak perish. The words of her instructors, the core tenet of Kaya philosophy, echoed in the sterile chambers of her mind. He was weak. His pride, a useless human emotion, had led him to this. The logical course of action was to let nature correct his error. But the logical course of action felt like a lie. The instructors' voices were drowned out by a flood of unwanted memories. The memory of him throwing himself in front of a predator for her. The sound of his quiet, off-key humming as he mended his gear. The sight of the color-shifting, glowing scar on his skin. A scar she had created. A permanent mark of their connection. With a curse that was a raw, frustrated snarl, she moved. She stormed out into the gale, the wind tearing at her, and grabbed his arm. He was barely conscious, his face pale and his lips blue. "You infuriating savage!" she yelled over the wind, dragging him back toward the mouth of the cave. She hauled him inside into the relative quiet. The fire, neglected during their conflict, was little more than a pile of dying embers. The cave was already dangerously cold. They were both shivering, teeth chattering uncontrollably. Hypothermia was setting in. She threw another log on the fire, but it would take too long. There was only one source of heat left, their own bodies. She unfurled her thermal cloak and his pathetic, non-heating blanket. This was not a surrender to emotion. This was a tactical decision. The most direct way to combat catastrophic temperature loss was direct thermal transfer. It was logic. It was survival. She was in control. She pulled him down to the floor, wrapped the thin cloaks around them both, pressing her body against his. He was like a block of ice. She could feel the violent tremors running through him. And soon her own shivering matched his, huddled together in the dark. The last barriers between them, pride, prejudice, ideology, were being stripped away by the simple, brutal truth of the cold. She was just executing a survival procedure. That's all it was. But then he turned his head, his eyes barely lucid, finding hers in the dim light from the embers. She saw no anger in them. Only a bone-deep wariness and a flicker of something that looked devastatingly like trust. And in that moment, her logic shattered. The carefully constructed walls of her tactical decision crumbled, and all that was left was the raw, undeniable reality of their situation. Two broken, lonely people, clinging to each other for warmth at the end of the world. The fury she felt was at herself, for her coldness, for her cruelty. The shame was for the words she'd used to wound him, and the need was a terrifying physical ache. She initiated it, a logical action to generate friction, to raise their core temperatures faster. She leaned in, her lips finding his, a desperate, bruising kiss. It was meant to be a function, a mechanism. It was a fire. It wasn't tender. It was a raw, messy, violent collision. It was the heat of her shame meeting the ice of his despair. It was the surprising, shocking jolt of his hands, no longer cold, coming up to tangle in her hair, pulling her closer. It was her own gasp against his mouth, a sound of surprise at the tidal wave of emotion that crashed over her. The logical decision had become an emotional cataclysm, a desperate, searing warmth in the absolute wreckage of their worlds. They woke, tangled together, the thin cloaks a mess around them. The storm had passed, in the pale morning light filtering into the cave. A new and terrifying silence had descended. A silence freighted with shame, confusion, and a new intimacy that felt more dangerous than the open hostility it had replaced. Rafe's usual armor of sarcasm was gone. He moved away from her slowly, deliberately, not looking at her. He sat up, his back to her, and ran a hand over his face. He flinched, his fingers tracing the edge of the color-shifting scar on his side, visible through the tear in his suit. It glowed faintly in the dim light, a permanent, faintly glowing reminder of their bond. His quiet, somber stillness unnerved Vela more than his sharpest barbs ever had. They retreated into their morning routine, but every movement was freighted with a new weight. Every shed glance was held a second too long. Every accidental brush of their hands was an electric shock. They were two magnets that had been forced together, and now, even when they pulled apart, the invisible pull remained. For days, they avoided each other's eyes. The silence in the cave grew, broken only by the necessary words for survival, each one carefully chosen and neutral. Finally, during a quiet moment, while they were cleaning the catch from their trap, Rafe broke. He set down the knife he was using. "The tactical logic was sound," he said, his voice low and rough. He was repeating her words back to her, but they were hollow. "My pilots are still dead, Vela. Logic doesn't change that." He looked at his hands. "Logic doesn't bring Kira back. It doesn't stop me from hearing Rorik's final transmission every time I close my eyes." He finally looked at her, his eyes full of pain so deep it was ancient. "So, thank you for the analysis, Commander. But your absolution is insufficient." He expected her to retreat into cold logic, to tell him that grief was an inefficient emotion. Instead, she put down her own tool and met his gaze. Her silver eyes were serious, searching. "2 rotations before this war began," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "I was a sub-commander in the Quel'Tha system. We were quelling an insurgency on a mining moon. My intelligence reported the primary insurgent stronghold was in a civilian habitation block. The logical course of action, the one that would end the rebellion with minimal Serethi casualties, was to sterilize the block from orbit." She looked away, toward the mouth of the cave. "I gave the order. The logic was perfect. Over 900 insurgents eliminated. The rebellion was crushed in a single day." She paused, and her next words were barely a whisper. "The intelligence was flawed. The insurgents were miners protesting working conditions. There were families, children. My logic resulted in the deaths of over 4,000 civilians, my own people. She looked back at him, and for the first time, he saw not a commander, not an alien, but a soldier, haunted by her own ghosts. The outcome is not the choice, Pilot Kelter, she said, her voice thick with a shared, bitter understanding. It is a lesson, a weight, and it is one we both must carry. It wasn't absolution. It was a shared burden, a confession for a confession. The labels of human and Zarethi, victor and vanquished, dissolved. They were just two soldiers, from opposite sides of a stupid war, who had both made the right choice and gotten the wrong answer. A bridge of shared failure, more powerful than any logic, formed between them. That night, a fragile peace settled over them. The awkwardness was replaced by a quiet, solemn understanding. Rafe picked up the worn paperback of Moby Dick, which had survived the storm. You never did tell me what this was about, Vela said, her voice soft from her side of the fire. It's complicated, he said. Explain it. It wasn't a command, it was a genuine request. He hesitated, then opened the book to the first page. Call me Ishmael, he read, his voice a low rumble in the quiet cave. He started to summarize, but she stopped him. Read it, as it was written. And so he did. He read aloud for over an hour, the archaic, poetic language filling the space between them. At first he felt foolish, but her intense, focused attention was captivating. She didn't interrupt, but he could see her mind working, processing the alien concepts. When he finally paused, she asked, This Captain Ahab, he knows the whale is just a creature, yes? An animal acting on instinct. Why does he assign it malice? Because it took his leg, Rafe said. It maimed him. It represents everything that ever hurt him. An illogical transference of blame, she stated. Maybe, Rafe conceded. Or maybe that's just what people do. We need something to hate, something to fight, otherwise we'd have to face the fact that the universe is just random. That horrible things happen for no reason at all. It's easier to hunt a monster than it is to live in a world without answers. He looked at the fire, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. It's easier to blame yourself for a tactical error than to admit your friends died for nothing. She was silent for a long time. I understand, she said finally, and these simple words were a universe of meaning. It was in that moment, sharing a story by a dwindling fire, that the last of the walls between them turned to dust. Their survival became a shared rhythm, but their ultimate goal remained escape. Rafe retrieved the long-range comms unit he'd salvaged from the Nomad. The casing was dented, the power converters fried, but the heart of it, the fused silica amplifier, was merely cracked. I can't fix this, he said, laying the pieces out. This component is grown in a zero-gravity lab under specific hyper-resonant frequencies. It can't be repaired in the field. Your field, perhaps, Vela said, picking up the two broken halves. He'd seen her do it before, in small ways. She'd used a focused bioresonance to purify a stagnant pool of water, and once to diagnose the extent of her own internal injuries, her hand glowing with a faint light as she passed it over her torso. It was an established part of her Zarethi toolkit. Not magic, but a focused application of biology. This will take all of my energy, she said. I will be vulnerable. For 5 days, she sat in a meditative trance. the broken amplifier in her hands. A faint pearlescent light emanated from her palms, bathing the shards in a soft glow. She was using her own bioelectric field, her life force, to emit a precise resonant frequency, coaxing the fractured atomic lattice to bond, to heal itself. Rafe became her guardian. He stood watch, hunted and foraged for them both. He sat for hours, simply watching over her, filled with a fierce protective devotion. He was witnessing an act of pure creation, an order being born from chaos, and it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. The process was slow, painstaking, but as she worked, the intense bioresonant energy she was emitting pulsed outward from their cave, a unique, powerful signature, unlike anything else on the planet, a quiet, rhythmic song of creation, rippling out into space. On the 5th day, the amplifier was whole, pulsing with an internal light that mirrored the scar on his side. As Vela slumped back, exhausted but triumphant, Rafe finished his work, wiring the healed amplifier into the comms unit he'd jury-rigged with parts from a medkit and the dead drone. He flipped a switch. For a moment, only static. Then, a voice, faint and distorted, crackled through the speaker. Unidentified, resonant, energy signature detected. Source, Kainos 3. This is independent salvage vessel, Free Trader's Luck. Is someone down there singing? Or did my long-range sensors finally have a stroke? The voice wasn't Federation or Zyrethi. It was something else entirely. Something wild and unpredictable. The reality of rescue, or at least contact, crashed down on them. They looked at each other, a wild, desperate hope igniting in their eyes. This was a chance they hadn't even considered. Not a return to their old lives, but a door to a new one. We need a plan, Rafe said, a grin spreading across his face. A crazy, stupid, probably not gonna work plan. The only kind you were qualified to make, Vela replied, and for the first time he heard the ghost of a laugh in her voice. They formulated it quickly, a desperate gambit. They weren't military survivors, they were prospectors. Their ship had crashed. They'd pay for rescue with salvage rights to both wrecks, a simple transaction free of politics. It was a lie, but it was a good one. They stood on the highest ridge, the one overlooking their valley. As a new light descended from the heavens, the light was not the clean, sterile white of a Federation shuttle, but the flickering patchwork glow of an old, battered freighter, the Free Trader's Luck. This was it, the end of their isolation. Their time as just a human and a Zyrethi was ending. In moments they would be someone else entirely. A new fiction, a new life. He reached out and took her hand, her fingers long and cool, wrapped around his. First we had to survive this rock, he said, his old sarcastic smile returning, but this time it was gentle, full of a future he hadn't dared to imagine. Now we have to survive the whole damn galaxy. She squeezed his hand, her face set with a warrior's resolve he knew so well. But now it was for him, for them, for their insane, desperate plan. He looked at her, this astonishing, infuriating, brilliant, and brave alien who had remade his world. The words rose in his chest, heavy and undeniable, and true. I love you, Vela, he said, his voice thick with an emotion he'd thought had died with his squadron. She looked at him, at this chaotic, resilient, maddening human who had shown her what it was to be more than just a soldier. A small, genuine smile touched her lips, transforming her severe features into something breathtakingly beautiful. She didn't mirror his words, she didn't need to. Her declaration was an action, a promise. She raised their joint hands, a defiant banner against the universe. Together, she said. The single word was a vow. As the freighter's ramp lowered with a groan and a plume of exhaust, revealing the silhouette of a grizzled-looking captain, Rafe and Vela didn't move. They simply tightened their grip on each other's hand and faced their uncertain future, a united front, ready for the first day of their new war.